One of the most interesting lyrics that I ever came across was from a band called Hot Milk, and in their song Wide Awake, uh, these lyrics kind of changed the way I kind of viewed my mentality towards like the weekend and towards life and towards my even my 9 to 5 job. And you know, one of the biggest things I think too is that we viewed the weekend and we view time as kind of like an enemy. We kind of view the end of the weekend as an enemy. We kind of view time and feeling like we don't have enough time as an enemy. And so we're going to talk more about this right after this intro.
And who, at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat.
Welcome to Winter Arc Podcast. So the Winter Arc, if you don't really understand that term, if you're not really a part of my generation per se, the Generation Z, the Winter Arc is kind of about during the winter months of the year. So from the Burr months, the start of the Burr months till about February, the end of February, the Winter Arc is kind of like this time of span where it's not about a period of reset or refreshment or like making new goals. It's rather a time of resistance where during the hardest months of the year to actually make a new habit, it's basically this season where people choose, okay, well, I'm going to go and work out more this winter, and I'm going to like for instance, other generations would call it, I'm going to get a summer bod this winter. But Generation Z has kind of taken the summer bod idea but turned it into this thing called the Winter Arc. But it's basically this idea that during the months that are the hardest to make a new habit and to be productive, it basically is about trying to form new habits and basically try to push this productivity mindset in our own selves. And oftentimes the Winter Arc, I guess, trend title, quote unquote, is often associated with like people who go to the gym often and want to build a bunch of muscle and stuff like that. But for this podcast in particular, yeah, sure, we're going to talk about productivity and habit. But I guess I wanted to use this because a lot of people associate grit and the will to want to make their own life better, kind of. And so I'm not an expert, I'm not a life coach or anything like that, but I just thought I would record my journey through my Winter Arc, I guess, kind of, if you want to call it that, and basically share what I think really where productivity comes from and from where our actual motivations come from when we make new habits and when we want to break bad habits, especially. And so that's kind of like what this podcast is going to be about. And, ultimately, I'm a Christian too, so like a part of what I'm going to be talking about is like what biblical productivity also looks like. And so that's where I'm kind of coming from for this podcast. And the other thing I want to talk about too is the fact that like there's a huge difference between productivity and toxic productivity. And so then we're going to get into more of that as time goes on. But basically, there's going to be episodes like this where they're longer and they're about a certain topic or a certain idea I want to talk about, a certain aspect of productivity I want to talk about. But then there's going to be the daily kind of like journals that I make of just like how my day's going and how I'm kind of processing all of this and all the other stuff, if that makes kind of a sense. But basically, let's just get started, right? We're going to be thinking about these lyrics in a second. But when I say these lyrics, I'm going to connect them later on in a way that like reframes our thinking into not thinking as productivity as a toxic thing, because oftentimes we think of productivity and we feel like, oh, we need to strive and we need to do these things in our own strength and try to do them in our own power. But in reality, it's like the more we strive to become better at who we are as a person or what we do on a daily basis with our habits, honestly, the less we get done because we just end up in this cycle. And that's kind of like where I'm going to go with this. But one of the most interesting lyrics that I've ever come across in a song was from Wide Awake by Hot Milk. And it was one of the most interesting lyrics because I believe it's a mental state that we all kind of like get into and that we want to ultimately escape. But it's the lyrics themselves go, I'm not living for the weekend, I'm living for myself. And I also want to give another quote of the first verse that goes hand in hand with that. But this theme I wanted to go with because so many times we get into this mindset of just like waiting for the weekend and making time our enemy. And so what does that ultimately mean? Like, for instance, like we always see the weekends as kind of like this victory goal in our every week. Like, especially if you have a 9 to 5 job, right? You're always thinking, oh, I could do this on the weekend. I can finally finish that project on the weekend. I can finally clean my house on the weekend. I can finally XYZ, you right? But the biggest thing is that, the other thing that also make the weekends qualitatively better are things like free time, family time, less stress, more time for things like hobbies, more time for projects, as I said, and more time for even like a side hustle, or even if you're trying to build a business. And same thing, and a lot of positive things are also associated with the weekend. Like, for instance, weekend events like church, small festivals, neighborhood cookouts, and the list goes on, as well as friends' birthdays, friends' events, and friends' parties and stuff like that. So while these things are usually associated with the weekend, these events obviously don't always happen just on the weekend. Like, there are other events throughout the week and not just on the weekend. And yeah, are they usually harder to get to because you're busy? Absolutely. And that's why we always associate the weekend with something that's so much better. But basically, the one thing I want to highlight in these lyrics is that it says, I'm not living for the weekend. So there's a false expectation when we think about the weekend, and how we always think about this in an unhealthy mindset, that and obviously it's a hard thing to break, because all of our life we're kind of thinking about the weekend. Every single week at the beginning of Monday, we're already thinking about, and actually sometimes even making plans for the next weekend. And so we need to break this unhealthy mindset one day at a time by actually looking at the time that we do have in our daily lives and actually breaking it apart into pieces. And so one of the biggest things is that, for instance, especially if you hate your job, right? It's really easy to look towards the weekend and be really excited about it, right? Because you're like, well, I hate my job, but I'm in it because I make money and I need to make a living, right? We all need to make a living. So sometimes we're stuck in things that we are just forced to do that we do not want to do and have no desire to do. And fair enough. Thankfully, I'm not in that spot myself, but there's so many people out there that are in that spot. And, obviously, there's there's the people that say, well, then go get a new job. But it's just not as simple as that. And I sympathize with that when people have a job that they just hate, honestly. And so that's one of the things that we just realize, that if we make time our enemy, and if we blame the things in our life that are honestly themselves like isolated and stuff like that. Like, for instance, with work, with what I just said, right? If you hate your job, you're going to make work and your job your enemy, right? Because you have a scapegoat, you have something to blame for everything else. Like, for instance, and the hardest thing too is that if you have your own goals, and if you have your ultimate idea of what productivity looks like to you, then we need to break that down, because so many times we find ourselves in this loop where we can't actually accomplish the goals that we have for ourselves, even if they're small goals, like cleaning the house. Like, for instance, in a normal day, I know exactly how it feels like. You're just you get back, your shift ends, right, at work. Your shift ends at work. You get into your car. You're starting to drive through traffic. You realize you need some gas. You had to pull off and get some gas. Then your wife texts you, or someone texts you, says, oh, I need this. And would you be able to pick up this on the way back? And then you go to that store, try to pick up the thing they need. But then guess what? That thing isn't in that store. So you have to go to the next store. And then thankfully they finally have it. But then you realize that store doesn't have the other thing they just texted you about a second ago again. And then you have to go to another store. And then suddenly your whole commute home becomes this whole adventure type thing happening. And then you kind of make the excuse of, I don't have the time to do XYZ. It could be cleaning the house. It could be a hobby that you love to do, but maybe you're kind of burnt out from it because you feel like you don't have time, and you make time your enemy, and you feel like that you're able to actually to make the random things in life that pop up in your life an enemy and a scapegoat. Like, for instance, with the thing that I just said, that's a very real scenario. If you have a family and you're taking care of a family, right? Or even if it's just yourself, you need to do XYZ before you come home, and there's a lot of stress in that, and there's several things to do before you actually get home and finally eat and finally can do nothing. But then guess what? You can't do nothing because there's dishes in the sink. There's things that are pressuring you to actually address them. But then guess what? You're too exhausted, too burnt out from the day. They finally are you're just well, I'm just going to give up. What's the point? And then guess what? The doom scrolling happens. The doom scrolling starts. And then what do? You start to actually go into the spiral of comparison. And the thing is that like, before we get into more of this idea of like comparison and how this eats away at your motivation and the false lie that everything has to be perfect and how perfection often rules our mindset when we're trying to accomplish some of our goals, is the fact that like we think we have to enjoy ourselves. So we're very selfish creatures by nature. And so oftentimes when we come home after a very long day and a very stressful day at times, sometimes like for instance, if work was stressful and then you had to pick up XYZ from the store and then you had a bunch of random setbacks that kept happening to you before you even ate dinner, and there, like in your normal 15-minute drive becomes a 45-minute drive from and to work sometimes. So what happens though is that we become exhausted and we force ourselves to think that we have to enjoy ourselves. And then, but guess what? At the end of that level that you're playing on a video game, or at the end of the show that you're watching, or after watching the season finale of that show, you're left with what? Nothing. You didn't accomplish anything that night. You didn't accomplish anything because why? Because you told yourself and you lied to yourself and basically made time your enemy. And so you basically said, well, I have to enjoy myself. I have to relax tonight. But then guess what? You just ended up stressing more because you didn't fold the laundry. You didn't do any of this stuff. So it's just the idea of like, are we going to make time our enemy? Or are we actually going to change and break this loop? But as I said, even after all of this, then the doom scrolling starts. Right? This is a great like loop of just chaos that we all live in modern day America, especially. Like we convince ourselves that time is our enemy. Then we get home, have an exhausting day, force ourselves to have fun because we have to have fun. We have to relax before the next workday comes up. Then all of a sudden, we're comparing ourselves to everyone on the internet, whether it be our friends on Facebook or whatever, or Instagram, or whether it be the tens of thousands content creators. And mind you, this is their job. They don't have a job outside of creating this content. And suddenly we're comparing how we cook, how we fold laundry, how we do the normal things of life, how we even like fill up the gas in our car and change our oil, to people on the internet who like make it out like as if life can be like pushed into this perfection world, kind of like this meta perfection world. And suddenly the meta world, and not meta as in the meta company, but the like meta as in something that seems truer than truth itself. And suddenly this meta world and this something that seems more real than real life becomes this thing where we compare ourselves, and suddenly we compare ourselves to these things that are impossible to achieve on social media, basically. And then we convince ourselves that, oh, well, I'm not going to do XYZ now because I can't achieve perfection. And that's honestly such a self-evidence of selfishness in our own life. And so like, one of the things is that like, if we can't achieve perfection, then there's no sense in doing it. Like that's actually selfishness in itself. Like think about it, because like we give up and push towards laziness that enables our selfishness and to be inward towards our time and towards our lack of ambition and motivation. And so that's where selfishness can actually breed, when we're finally like, oh, well, I give up because I'm not perfect like this person on social media. I'm not perfect like my friend over here on Facebook or whatever. But guess what? Everyone else is comparing their life to you too. Probably. Or even if they aren't, they're comparing it to someone. So it's just the reality that like we live in this constant cycle of just chaos, and we think it's okay. We think it's normal. We think this is just everyday life. Like it's okay for me to be burnt out at the end of the day and to lose all motivation to do just the simplest tasks of life. And granted, I'm like, this also can lead to depression and anxiety, but this isn't the main cause of depression and anxiety, so don't quote me on that. But the whole point is like this whole cycle, and on top of something, if you deal with like depression, anxiety, or other mental health issues, right? I can't even imagine dealing with this cycle of chaos and also dealing with like clinical depression or anxiety or whatever it is. And so like that's the one main thing that I wanted to say. Like, I'm not a mental health professional, I'm not a counselor, I'm not anything like that. But I wanted to preface this because it's just like the fact is that all these things can lead to those things. And even if you are trapped in this like cycle of depression or whatever, I believe that like what I might say might help, might not. Like, we're all different. So don't listen to what I say on this podcast and be like, oh, why isn't it working for me? We all have our separate motivations. We all have basically a different way we tick, basically. So like, what might work for me in the way that I perceive motivation for myself and the way that I'm able to be productive in my personal life might be different for you. And that's okay. But I will say, if you do struggle with depression and anxiety, then that's something that you need to talk to a mental health provider or mental health counselor professional with, because I'm not that person. And I'm not going to pretend that I know the answers to whatever, because there's underlying issues that even like affect our daily life with like things like trauma and etc. But I just wanted to say that just to say, like, if you are stuck in something like that and something deeper than just feeling unproductive, don't listen to me as if I know the answers, because I definitely don't. But but this podcast, I feel like, can be beneficial to almost anyone, even if you are struggling with depression, because this podcast isn't about, oh, we're going to go out, we're going to hustle hard, and we're going to go make money. Like, this isn't that podcast. It just isn't. And that's like the attitude on the internet right now and on different productivity podcasts and stuff like that, because everyone's so focused on money that they don't realize that our love of money is slowly breaking our society down into these little circles of selfishness where we don't even realize what's even happening to us as people. And so that's what this podcast is mostly about. It's not going to be about me telling you get rich quick schemes, because this isn't even going to be a business podcast. This is literally just kind of like a podcast that has to do with just reality and where motivation lies, and where can we find motivation in the midst of our busy life. And one way we do that, and one way we don't do that, is through making time our enemy. But the real question is, now that I prefaced all that and all that other stuff, I just wanted to get that out there so that people kind of know where I'm coming from this. But where do we break the loop? Or how do we break the loop? How do we break this loop of chaos of getting off work, doing all this stuff before dinner, finally eating dinner, giving up on like our goals and stuff that we want to do, that are best intentions basically, but then realizing I don't have the energy for it, or I'm too exhausted to do XYZ, even if it's just cleaning the house or something, right? Then all of a sudden, because we didn't do those things, then we get more depressed, and then we look on our phone, start comparing ourselves to other people, and then go to bed. Like, that's a great way to live. That's amazing, right? And I'm not saying I'm perfect at any means. Like, this is literally me just sharing my thoughts about the realization behind this and me wanting to change myself. And that's why I made this podcast, because it's kind of like going to be an everyday journal of me kind of like talking about my thoughts and talking about how I'm trying to create motivation for myself. And so the way this chaotic loop stops is by making the tough decisions. And what are these tough decisions? They aren't a formula, they aren't a book, they aren't a seminar, and they're not a religious mantra. And I'll get back to the religious mantra part, because I am going to include different things about what biblical productivity looks like. But what I mean by religious mantra is mostly like, for instance, it's not like this prayer you pray and then all of a sudden you're just so productive and you're so successful and so on. It's not magic, okay? It's through these tough decisions that we have to make in our daily lives, these micro decisions that actually create the motivation for us to do harder things and to ultimately accomplish harder goals even. And so that's why I love the one quote from Yoda. You're like, where is this going? From Yoda from The Empire Strikes Back. And so in the scene of The Empire Strikes Back, I'm going to give you some context if you've never watched Star Wars. Yoda is trying to teach Luke Skywalker to basically become a Jedi to fight Darth Vader, right? The main villain of the Star Wars universe basically. He's also the main character of the Star Wars universe, but that doesn't matter. But all you have to know is that Darth Vader is the villain, right? If you've never watched it. But Luke Skywalker is the one that's being trained by Yoda, the Master Jedi kind of figure. And basically, like, he's trying to teach Luke that it's not about trying. It's not about striving to become something, if that makes sense. And so during this scene, Luke, like, long story short, Luke crashed on the planet that Yoda lives on, right? And his plane got stuck in this swamp, basically, like sinking down in quicksand and stuff. And so Yoda was like, well, you need to use the Force and lift that plane out of the pit. And he's just like, he looks at it and he's like, and during this training, he was like training with different rocks and small rocks, right? And using the Force to lift them up, stack them, stuff like that. But basically, Luke was like, well, how can I lift this huge plane with the Force if I can only do these little stones? And so he tries to lift it up, and then like he's about to, but then he just gives up. And well, actually, no. Before he lifts it up, Yoda says this line to him. He says, "Do or do not, there is no try." But Luke tries to do it. He doesn't do it. And I'll tell you why that matters, why that language matters. He tries to do it, and he fails. Ultimately, he's about to lift it out of the lift the ship out of the mud, out of the swamp, but he fails. And so Luke kind of hints like, well, if I can't do it, you can't do it, because Yoda's this like little midget frog thing, right? But Yoda, right after Luke gives up, Yoda lifts the whole ship out of the swamp using the Force, right? So where am I taking this? Because you're like, okay, well, now you're talking about science fiction, and maybe you've never watched the film, so it confuses you more. But let's break down this quote from Yoda: "Do or do not, there is no try." So this quote kind of encapsulates the reality behind the decisions that are creating momentum in your life. So, as an example, right, we can't strive, we can't try, because that ultimately doesn't leave us with any kind of motivation, because we're just trying it out. We're kind of thinking in the back of our head, when we think about the word try, right, we're thinking, oh, well, I can try to do this, but if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. But then meanwhile, when we do something, like for instance, like think about something you do really well, right? If you go out and do it, you aren't trying it. You're doing it because you know how to do it really well. Okay? That's a good example, actually. So we need realistic goals in our life. And so maybe one of the goals is just to simply keep the house clean on a weekly basis, right? Something simple, something achievable, right? So this is a very achievable goal until, guess what? The decision to actually start doing it happens. Because in our mind, we have the best intentions for our life, right? Or the best intentions we think. And we think, oh, well, of course I'm going to clean my house. But then you don't end up doing it. And then 2 weeks pass by, and then you're like, oh, my friends are coming over tomorrow, so I better clean the house. Then you rush around and clean the house before your friends come over the next day. Or you can make the tough decision and do the hard thing and start doing it. So you decide, okay, I don't want to do this. I have no desire to do this. I have no desire to do the work now, but I want to accomplish the goal. So I'm going to choose to do it. So you choose to do it even though you have no desire to do it. Within 5 minutes into cleaning your bathroom or doing the dishes or whatever you're doing in the house, as an example for the goal of cleaning your house, you realize, oh, this isn't bad. And you get this like weird boost of motivation out of nowhere, and you realize, oh, well, since the dishes are done, I'm going to go mop the floor, or I'm going to go take the trash out, and whatever. Or like if you have a chore chart, for instance, like this is what me and my wife do, for instance, like we just have a chore chart and we're just like, oh, what do I have to do today? And that's a great way of motivation, because guess what? If I accomplish my chores today, it motivated me, even if I didn't want to do them, right? It motivated me to want to do it tomorrow. Why? Because I was able to give myself some healthy serotonin, whatever it is. I'm not a psychologist or a scientist. I don't know what it's called. I know it's a chemical in the brain or something like that that makes your brain like addicted to the feeling of serotonin or whatever it is. But the idea just sticks there, whether or not you're a scientist or whether or not you're a doctor at all, or a counselor or whatever, or psychiatrist. It's the fact of, if you say yes to doing the work, the hard part is not doing the work. The hard part is not doing it. The hard part was deciding to do it. And so if you're willing to make the decision, if you're willing to do the part, then you're going to do it. Does that make sense? Like, I don't know if that makes sense, but that's the way that I've seen it for myself. Oftentimes I'm just like, I have no desire to vacuum right now, but I'm going to do it. And then 3 minutes in, I'm just like, oh, this isn't bad. Because it's a psychological like thing that we do to ourselves. As I said before, we make time our enemy and we say, oh, I can't do it because I don't have time. I need to enjoy myself before the workday tomorrow or whatever it might be. And so one of the things that I want to bring up too is the fact of like, the reality is that in Yoda's quote, for instance, right? We cannot try in our own strength in anything that we try to do ourselves, right? We have to do it. We just have to make the tough decision. Because again, the tough part is not doing it. It's not trying to do the work to accomplish the goal. The hard part is the motivation to do it. And so it's not this trick. People like often think like, oh, I can trick myself into motivation. No, you either make the decision or you don't. And then if you try, you usually just don't do it because you just said to yourself, well, I'll try, but if I meet any resistance while I try, I'm just going to give up. And so that's what kind of Yoda kind of meant by that quote when he was training Luke to become a Jedi like himself. And even though that the Yoda thing and the Star Wars example is silly, I think it's just such a good example of what motivation can look like and what motivation really is. It's the decision to do that thing. It's not a formula, as I said. It's nothing like that. And so before I close out this episode, because I'm not going to make like the main episodes even that long either. I was thinking 40 minutes, but I don't think it's going to be that long. But I really want to include a biblical moment for my episodes too, because I have to be honest with myself, right? I'm a Christian. So even though this podcast is about productivity, that means my faith also lies in the way that I view productivity. And so that's what I want to kind of talk about too. And if you're not a Christian, just bear with me, because even if you aren't a Christian, the what the scriptures say and what the Bible say about certain things, there's actually a lot of wisdom in it. And many people throughout the years who weren't even Christians have used the Bible as kind of like a way to view different ways that they've gathered wisdom for themselves. And so that would just be my prayer, that you would just be open to what I say about the Bible and to what I say about biblical productivity, because a lot of where my mindset is coming from this is from my faith. Because ultimately, I really believe I can't do a lot of things that I need to do in my life or the goals that I have, whether it be spiritually, personally, whatever, unless God's in them. So, and what I said earlier about it, like productivity not being a part of a religious mantra, this is not a religious mantra. It is ultimately a realization of what God can do through me in my daily life. And so in James 1:22, do not merely listen to the word and so deceive yourselves, do what it says. And so in James, in this verse, it's kind of just about the fact of like, when we're doing things as Christians, right? And as people of faith, we can either, like for instance, God talks a lot about how if we're not bearing fruit in our lives, like for instance, if we're not loving people, if we're not doing the things that we should as Christians, as an example, then we're not bearing the fruit. We're not actually doing what God has like maybe called us to, or maybe has built in our lives. And so this verse kind of speaks that about, like, you can hear the scriptures, you can listen to the scriptures, you can listen to sermons, you can go to church all you want, but are you going to be a doer of the word? And the same thing goes for a part of that, like aside from that, in Romans 7:18, for I have desired to do what is good, but I cannot carry it out. And that's the last part of Romans 7:18. And that verse encapsulates, and many people, and a lot of Christians, and I'm not like nitpicking a certain denomination or anything like that, but a lot of Christians look at Romans 7, they're like, oh, well, that's how I feel. And Romans 7 is all about, I want to do the things that I desire to do that are good, but I end up doing the things that I don't want to do, which are evil, and the list goes on, right? But the reality is that Romans 7 is the Christian isn't the Christian. It isn't the person who's saved. It isn't the person who's walking by faith and walking by the Spirit. It's the person who is still in the flesh. And so what does that mean? So for instance, later on in the next chapter is kind of known as if you're walking in the Holy Spirit, if you're walking in the Spirit. So the Romans 7 is like, this is the dead man. He desires to do good, but can't, because guess what? He's unable to do good unless God is in him. So that's kind of like the idea of where that comes from, where Romans 7 is coming from. But Romans 8, 5 through 6, those who live according to the flesh have their minds set on what the flesh desires. But those who live in accordance with the Spirit have their minds set on what the Spirit desires. The mind governed by flesh is death, but the mind governed by the Spirit is life and peace. And this is the main thing I wanted to bring up too, especially if you're a Christian, especially if you're struggling with whether it be productivity or even just your faith life even, is just the fact that we can strive in our flesh as much as we want, and we can try to set our minds on what we think is good for ourselves. And we can stress, and try to do. And we can try to check off every list of, I went to church, I did this, I did that. But guess what? It doesn't matter, because we didn't set our minds on things above. We didn't set our minds on what the Spirit desires, which brings peace. And so that's the thing I wanted to kind of end on. The note I kind of wanted to end on is these verses and the reality of that God is calling us to even lives that are productive through him. Like, we can't do this on our own. Even just simple things in life, even just being productive in our daily life and being stewards of the things that God has given us, whether it be our money, our time, or whatever it is. And so that's the thing I want to kind of leave you guys with, of the reality of what productivity is and what it isn't. And that's something I might talk about more in the next podcast next week. Again, every day is going to be kind of like an update journal of like what I did today and like other random things like that. But I really want to eventually stress the importance of what good productivity looks like and toxic productivity looks like. Because what these verses are talking about, the fleshly desires, that's the version of toxic productivity. We think we can do it by ourselves. We think we can do it in our own strength. But the truth is, we can't. And so that's where I kind of want to leave you guys, and kind of where what I wanted to talk about today, and how I wanted to start this podcast. So if you guys really enjoyed this podcast and you want to see more, just comment and just even ask questions about like how I view certain things within productivity, how I view things within how to achieve goals and stuff like that. And guess what? I'm not pretending to be an expert. I'm not a life coach. I'm not anything like that. I'm just a guy wanting to record my own progress and how I'm trying to basically be more productive in my personal, spiritual, and even just like, hopefully even like in a financial way, maybe. I don't know. We'll just have to see where this podcast goes. And that's kind of like where I'm coming from. And I hope you guys can kind of understand, if you're not a Christian, kind of understand where I'm coming from and where my mindset is. And if even if you aren't religious, just let Bible verses like these to kind of tell you something deeper than what you would find in, like, for instance, human philosophy, or just like man's philosophy, kind of. Because there is such a thing as a God, and he loves you, and he wants you to realize that there's more to life than just striving for something more, like money and whatever. Because guess what? You can have all the money in the world and you will still be unhappy. That's just reality. So and I know everyone says that and everyone thinks it's cliche, but it's just true. I mean, there's been times when I'm just like, where I have a surplus of money or like extra money in my bank account at the end of a pay period, and after I even pay all my bills, and even after I like go out or just buy myself something, and I still have money left over. And guess what? If I'm not content and I'm not actually living for him, it doesn't mean anything. Like, that's just reality. So I just want to leave you guys with those thoughts. And as I said, comment. I'm going to try to do this every week, like a main episode every week, but then a mini episode every day. The mini episodes are going to be like 3 minutes, 5 minutes. I don't know. But you guys have a great day, and I hope to see you in the next one.